Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 43rd webinar in the Offshore Wind Series, Learning from the Experts. I am Kimberly Verderber, Senior Project Manager with NYSERDA's Renewable Optimization and Energy Storage Innovation Team. And it is my pleasure to be joined by today's expert, Christine Sloan, with the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium. Before I introduce Christine, a few reminders for participants and some background on this webinar series. Next slide, please. Firstly, if you are experiencing any technical issues, please contact Sal Gravin at the email address on the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Experts series are available on NYSERDA's website at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions for the speakers. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goals of 70% renewable sources of electricity by 2030 and 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select learning from the expert speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you would like to suggest a topic or speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshore-wind@nyserda.ny.gov. or fill out a survey, also available on our website. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter. Next slide, please. It is now my pleasure to introduce Christine Sloan. Christine is the Deputy Executive Director of the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, also known as NOWRDC, a not-for-profit organization that collaborates with industry on prioritized R&D activities to reduce the levelized cost of energy of offshore wind in the U.S. while maximizing other economic and social benefits. Christine leads NOWRDC's strategic, operational, and research efforts, including overseeing a broad offshore wind portfolio of over $45 million in research and innovation. Thank you. I will now hand things over to our speaker.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you all for joining me this afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you all today. So I'm going to have us go right to our next slide. As a little bit of introduction to NOWRDC and a little bit of who we are, I'll give a little bit of background here. So the consortium, or NOWRDC, was created back in 2018. We are a 501c3, and really what our mission is to advance offshore wind technology R&D through competitive grants. So we have been around since 2018. We have a number of different membership organizations. We're very thankful for the Department of Energy and for NYSERDA, who really helped to stand us up and create the 501c3 that we are today. Today we work with many more states with offshore wind developers, with other public and independent members that make up the consortium, which I'll tell you a little bit more about on some subsequent slides. So again, our mission as the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, you can imagine, is to have a very national US-centric focus. And as a non-for-profit, we really work closely with industry, collaborating very closely on funded prioritized R&D activities. What we work to do is really accelerate the deployment of offshore wind in the US and address different challenges and obstacles that are most important right now to the offshore wind industry, trying to maximize the economic and social benefits domestically as well. And of course, trying to reduce the levelized cost of energy of offshore wind in the US. Next slide. So some of these core activities, how do we actually go about doing that mission? Some of that we do through funding innovation directly responsive to the technology, or I should say technical and supply chain barriers faced by developers in the US. And I think the key words here that I'd like to just underline is directly responsive. We want to make sure that as the consortium, as we're funding R&D, we are being as responsive to the most highest priority needs as possible. We're not doing research just for research's sake. We're not trying to do research that gets put on a shelf somewhere and kind of sits around. We want to make sure that we're being directly responsive to a really clear need in the industry and working with folks in the industry, including developers and government, to make sure that we can address those needs as best as we can. We also work to convene really strong networks. That's working with some of those members that I had mentioned earlier, as well as really trying to connect technology innovators, the research institutions who are oftentimes doing this research, different project developers, the supply chain companies, utilities, and of course, state and federal government agencies as well. It is half the battle sometimes to just be able to convene these really strong networks and to have really clear and strong relationships with all these different entities that span across the industry to have a final product that is a really strong R&D project and innovation at the end of the day. And so in order to really be able to prioritize the highest needs, as well as to leverage funding and leverage expertise and create really great innovation projects, we really focus on convening those strong networks. And of course, trying to increase US content and job opportunities as well. Next slide. So here's a little bit, again, if you're not familiar with the consortium, some of the folks that we work with. Our board and our members, we really try to engage industry and folks as much as possible. Again, going from government and utilities to offshore wind developers to other industry members in the US as well. I won't spend much time on this, so I'll just go to our next slide. So what I'd like to talk a little bit more about today is, of course, the actual innovation that I think is of most interest to all of you who are joining us this afternoon. And so to get to some of those innovations and to that R&D that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to take a step back and talk about how we actually go about choosing and funding and ultimately helping to commercialize some of that innovation. So where do we actually come up with the projects that we fund? Where do they come from? And oftentimes it comes back and starts with the consortium's research and development roadmap. So this is a document. It really is our overarching technical guidance document. You'll see we're on version 4.0 right now. That's because we work on updating this every 2 years or so. We want to make sure that this document, which is kind of everything in the kitchen sink, it is a rather large document, but what it really tries to do is make sure that it includes all the different challenges, R&D needs of the offshore wind industry at the time. So making sure that it is updated about every 2 years or so. A lot can happen in offshore wind in every 2 years, but making sure that it is updated frequently so that it includes the most high priority and needs of the offshore wind industry. Some things change. Sometimes there's a very clear change in focus in a certain technology. Sometimes a certain technology, it's not necessarily crossed off the list as completed and done, but there's other higher priorities that come up over time. And so trying to reprioritize and include new challenges that we can address is something that we definitely try to include in these roadmaps. We break up the different challenges that we find throughout the offshore wind industry into 3 different pillars. And that's because the consortium really does take a full look across the entire offshore wind industry. Anywhere that R&D can help solve a challenge, that is what we work to focus on. So we try to break it up into different pillars to better understand these different categories that funding may go under and where we might be able to craft different R&D projects. So the first one here, Pillar 1, is offshore wind farm technology advancement. We have Pillar 2, which focuses on offshore wind power resources and physical site characterization. Pillar 3, the installation, operations, and maintenance and supply chain. And from those 3, we break it into other categories as well, which you'll see in a moment. And so what I'd like to just pause on for a moment is how we come across this roadmap. We work very closely with our members. We work really closely with other partners who are also within the offshore wind industry, and of course, working with others within the industry to make sure that we are very closely aligning with the capabilities that are out there. We work with academia, we work with national labs to make sure that there's real capabilities for the R&D that we're identifying in our roadmap. We want to make sure if there are not capabilities, that's something that we kind of put in our roadmap as well as a true need for the industry. And we want to make sure that we are putting in the roadmap the highest priority needs. And again, changing those as needed every 2 years or so. I will say, if you're interested in checking out this roadmap, which I would encourage, it is on our website, and we are going to be in the process of updating this version 4.0, which was released back in 2023, for a version 5.0 to be released early next year in 2025. So if you're interested in that process, or if you're interested in just seeing when that new roadmap comes out, definitely feel free to check out our website and stay in touch with the consortium. Next slide, please. So here's a bit more of a breakout of the different categories in offshore wind that we fund. Again, just to take a step back, I'm going to then walk through some of the different projects in these different categories that we have funded to date, just to give you an idea, because there are 7 different categories here. And while the consortium has funded over 50 different projects in offshore wind R&D throughout these different categories, as you can see, we don't have time for all 50 of the great projects today. So I'm going to try to take one project from each different category almost, and go through some of those with all of you this morning. But just to give you a breakdown, a little bit of how these different projects are broken up from those pillars, you'll see that we have in the top left here, wind resource and site characterization, supply and logistics, O&M and safety, electrical power systems, environmental and conflicting use, fixed structural engineering, and floating structure engineering. So again, this kind of breaks out a little bit even more what types of different R&D we fund. Those are all very broad still. And so I think what I'll do is try to break down for you today a little bit more of what each of these R&D projects mean, what kind of these broad topic areas could include, and then giving you specific examples of, you know, the actual projects that we have funded in each of these categories. But this is just to give you an idea of kind of how they might be spread out and the projects that we have funded to date. So with that, I'll ask us to go to our next slide. So the first category I'm going to start with here is focused on supply chain and logistics. So you'll see there's kind of 2 main categories here and then subcategories under those. Really what I think is important to the consortium as we're thinking about supply chain and logistics is really how the supply chain issues are central to the core objectives of the consortium and how they kind of cross-cut all other pillars as well. You can imagine that supply chain is going to be important across different areas of R&D and different aspects of the industry. But because it is so important, I've also taken it out and we consider it separate here too as well. So when we're thinking about supply chain for the offshore wind industry, of course, many of the components and subcomponents and infrastructure for some of the initial phases of commercial offshore wind, will be imported. However, the consortium definitely believes that the U.S. industrial base has most of the necessary capabilities to contribute to all aspects of the offshore wind supply chain. It is robust. And I think one of the primary goals of the consortium is to really fund research that helps to ensure that economic benefits of the U.S. offshore wind, development industry are maximized as much as possible. So part of that does include the acceleration and the maturation of the U.S. offshore wind supply chain, again, through different technology innovations and investments that favor domestic content. So this could include investments to adapt U.S. factories to manufacture major components such as blades, towers, nacelles, cables, substructures, and of course, infrastructure investments as well. That could include U.S. flagged vessels and accelerated upgrades to ports and the electric grid. So that all kind of falls under this supply chain and logistics category. On the next slide, we have one specific project in particular that I'll highlight as a project that has fallen under this category in the past, and that is a project with Crowley that was titled The Technical Validation of Existing U.S. Flagged Barges as a Feeder Solution for the U.S. Offshore Wind Industry. I'd like to highlight this project in particular because I think it's a great example of a project that was identified, funded, managed throughout its life cycle, and then was actually able to be utilized in the development of a South Fork wind farm. And so, of course, that's something that we're really proud of and really excited to see, not only for its findings and its approach. Of course, the project was highly successful, but that it was actually utilized in offshore wind development as well. So happy to see that. This project, to give you a little bit of background on what it was focusing on, it was really trying to look at the feasibility of using minimally modified U.S. flagged barges accompanied by tugs to efficiently deliver wind turbine generators to WTIVs, or wind turbine installation vessels. And they found that this approach really helped to streamline operations. It reduced downtime and cost and helped to leverage those existing vessels. And so we were really happy to see this being extremely successful, and is a good example of how some of the projects that we're funding when we're talking about supply chain and logistics really aim to commercialize what they're doing. We are hoping, as I mentioned earlier, not just fund R&D that is completed and put up on a shelf. We're not really doing basic research. We're really trying to make sure that we are funding work that is directly responsive to specific needs and that can be used, ASAP, that can be really helpful to the success of today's and tomorrow's offshore wind industry in the U.S. So really excited about this project and happy to point folks in the direction of any of these projects, PIs, and program managers at the consortium if helpful, if folks want to learn more about these projects. Next slide, please. So the next category I'm going to walk through is electric power systems. So the rapid deployment of offshore wind that is planned for the U.S. land-based grid, especially in the North Atlantic, can definitely create significant challenges for utilities, developers, regulators, policymakers, and it makes it difficult to introduce offshore wind industry to the existing infrastructure that we have today with minimal disruptions at low cost. And so what we're trying to get at with this topic area is really trying to cover the technical innovations that relate to the electrical infrastructure from the turbines to land-based interconnection, which does account for a fair percentage of CapEx or capital expenditure. And so really trying to make sure that we are, while costs are expected to increase as projects are sited farther from shore in deeper waters, as the number of suitable land-based kind of interconnection points become scarcer, that we're able to put forward innovation and R&D to help support the electric power system in the U.S. And to support the offshore wind industry, of course. So if we go to the next slide, here is one example of a project that does just that. There are actually, I think, two different projects here that I've highlighted, and I've highlighted two because they both go into and have supported the Atlantic offshore wind transmission study that was put forward by the Department of Energy and NREL, which is exciting for us as well to see a real collaboration between folks who are, doing the research that we are funding, and seeing that kind of collaboration being put into this Atlantic offshore wind transmission study. So we're very happy for those types of opportunities as well with the projects that we fund. And so when we're thinking about the electric power system here and the impact and industry significance that these projects have had, the Tufts project, which was titled Transmission Expansion Planning Models for offshore wind energy. Their project really worked to advance the state-of-the-art of the assessment of offshore wind transmission and the grid integration on the East Coast for generation capacities. They were looking to up to 200 gigawatts of capacities. And so that helped to really form not only a great R&D project that we were able to fund throughout its life cycle. That project is now completed, but that fed directly into this transmission study as well. The project that we funded with NREL, titled The Development of Advanced Methods for Evaluating Grid Stability Impacts, that project was still ongoing, I should say, and they're really helping to develop advanced modeling, control, stability monitoring, and protection methods for the analysis and mitigation of dynamic stability problems in offshore wind power plants. So again, helping to feed that information not only as a great innovation as a standalone project, but helping to feed into some of these larger projects and kind of looking across the entire Atlantic as well, feeding into this study. So yeah, happy to chat a little bit more about the electric power systems too, but I'm going to move right along because we do have a number of different topic areas that I want to make sure that we can get to in our short time today. So this next slide is focused on fixed and floating structure engineering. I put them here together, even though they can be very separate and they have, oftentimes very different issues, different R&D challenges, different needs for innovation, just because that kind of organizes well. But you can definitely imagine that we focus on these two different categories separately oftentimes as well. And same thing as I had mentioned earlier with supply chain and logistics, something that kind of cross-cuts all these other categories too. Same thing for fixed and floating. There's going to be specific fixed and floating needs and challenges that cross-cut different topic areas as well. But just for our topic area today, this at least gives you an idea of what some of these different topic area or subtopic areas look like, how we can actually walk through the different challenge areas and that we've prioritized here for these different structure engineerings. So keeping in mind that kind of innovative substructural solutions may be required or probably will be required to adapt these systems to, U.S. offshore, our own geotechnical conditions, our domestic supply chain, vessel availability, port facilities, and really trying to achieve different cost targets. Understanding that a lot of fixed and floating structure is being designed or had been designed in the past internationally with kind of different geotechnical conditions, supply chains, vessel availability, port facilities in mind, making sure that these are now all engineered and developed specifically with the U.S. domestic content in mind is going to be critical for not only, like I mentioned, cost targets, but also maximizing other economic and social benefits as well. So we want to make sure that all of these are focusing specifically for the U.S. And as the offshore wind industry continues to grow, we believe there's also a tremendous opportunity to innovate, modify, and optimize different substructures for U.S. offshore conditions, and to adapt these structures for manufacture and installation by U.S.-based companies. So we see a real opportunity to focus on that U.S. content, and that's something that we definitely try to prioritize and keep in mind when looking at R&D projects under this category. So to give you an example, we can go to the next slide. So here is one project here based with DEME, the tri-suction pile caisson foundation concept. And really what I want to highlight here is that ongoing research for this project, again, not reading everything on this slide. If you want to know more about the project itself, there is an entire project database on our website where you can go through and learn more about this specific design or this specific R&D concept innovation itself. But I think what I'd like to highlight is that ongoing research aims to streamline this tri-suction pile caisson foundation for easy installation, and the free-floating approach that they have here with this concept, relying on the buoyancy of suction piles, and it really could help to improve, and we've seen a real opportunity here for transportation and installation processes as well. And so looking at how different foundation concepts could work for fixed structural engineering that are, for like this project, noiseless, vibration-free, looking at the suction process, how does that also affect supply chain, as well as just installation, but also transportation. So thinking kind of well-roundedly about all aspects of these different innovations and designs to try to best cater to the needs of the industry. So that's for fixed structure. I think on the next slide, we have floating structure engineering. Here is one example from our floating structure engineering. This was from Triton Systems, and their project was innovative anchoring system for floating offshore wind. And they were really working on an anchor that you can see here in this great photo that was going to operationalize the use of a helical structure anchor to meet the offshore wind requirements. And so what they were able to do is develop, test this anchor concept, and then actually go through the ABS approval at the end as well, getting the prototype validation stage of their NTQ process too. So being able to actually develop and demonstrate the capacity of this anchor is a great opportunity for this team, and something that we found a lot of value in as well, trying to focus on the different challenges associated with anchoring floating offshore wind turbines specifically, and the different weights and forces that they would be subject to. So again, I'm not going into too much detail into any one project. If I did, which I would love to do, I think we'd be here all day. So if there are specific topic areas or specific projects that I'm highlighting that are of specific interest to you, I would definitely recommend going to our website where we have, again, a project database for projects that are completed, like for example, this Triton project. There is a public final report that is available for download on each of those websites as well. So you can see kind of the entire projects that these folks completed and get those end results from each of those projects as well. So I would encourage you to go and check those out, or reach out if you're interested in any specific project or interested in learning more about any one of these different categories and projects that we may have funded under any of them. But for now, I'll continue moving on to our next slide. So on this next slide, we have environmental and conflicting use. And I think something that is identified as being really important to the consortium is trying to proactively mitigate different siting conflicts that can have long-term benefits by shortening development timelines, which, to many just, they hear cost, and then minimizing curtailments and of course, strengthening community relationships as well. So being able to understand species presence during construction and operation, as well as potential risk mitigation options, is especially important in areas where endangered species, such as the North Atlantic right whale, that might be familiar to some of you, where they may be active. And so making sure that we are looking at technology that can actually mitigate wildlife conflicts and understanding the solutions for coexistence with other ocean users as well is definitely something that we see high value in working in supporting R&D. So if you would go to the next slide. Here is one of those projects. So this project with Worley Consulting was the technology development priorities for scientifically robust and operationally compatible wildlife monitoring and adaptive management. What you'll see is a kind of great image here, looking at different technology platforms and opportunities for actually looking at the monitoring that can be available. This is not all inclusive, but just a great image that they have that I wanted to share with you all here. And so really what they're looking at when trying to identify these different technology gaps is looking at the development of research priorities and reporting based on the literature, what their project focused on, but basing on the literature, they had 3 different expert workshops that they held, the development of a technologies database, summarizing the information on the capabilities and limitations of existing technologies, again, all of which are available and I think are linked on our website. So if you're interested in checking out those databases they were able to put together and the list of technologies and capabilities, definitely go and check those out. And while they were able to do a lot of that outreach, talking with different subject matter experts, trying to identify those gaps and have a real roadmap or a path forward to what are the needs, what are some of the kind of ways to move forward and processes that can help improve monitoring that don't just, end up you build a great offshore wind farm and then you realize you haven't planned for any monitoring, in your operation and maintenance throughout the life cycle of a wind farm, something like that. Making sure that those are kind of developed and planned for early on in the design process was definitely a key outcome from some of this work, and trying to understand, the capabilities for different, looking at both bird, they looked at birds as well, trying to understand the capabilities of bird collision and avoidance monitoring systems at offshore wind farms. That was something that they identified as critical too. And so trying to remain cost effective, safe, making sure it's scalable as needed. Are there different monitoring technologies that need to be put on turbines themselves? Are there certain monitoring technologies that could be better utilized at the farm scale? Again, what monitoring is needed before, during, and after installation, and trying to find that mismatch between timing, infrastructure, design, and the actual development of monitoring plans, trying to align that better. And so that was an exciting project that I believe is also complete at this time. So if you're interested in a final report and what came out of that, go and check that one out as well. And with that, we can go to our next slide. So one of the, I think the second to last topic area that I have here for you today is focusing on wind resource and site characterization. So of course, there are 2 different categories here kind of within the Met Ocean Research category and physical site characterization. This topic area really encourages the U.S. offshore wind industry and developers, scientific research institutions to work together to build validation and data sharing campaigns to lower the uncertainty in critical Met Ocean data sets and trying to increase confidence in U.S. leased area energy production potential, trying to increase certainty in high fidelity mesoscale weather models, really trying to, again, decrease uncertainty, increase confidence, and trying to validate these models as much as possible. Of course, models to assess extreme conditions is also of interest to the consortium. So things that could result in extreme loads and the accuracy of predicting frequency of extreme conditions and their occurrence, that can be considered under this topic area as well. But really what's going to be important is thinking about, before obviously there's design, understanding as best as you can the wind energy areas or lease areas and the actual Met Ocean data that's there as well, to best understand some of these other R&D innovation needs. So whether that be fixed or floating, whether that be the environmental and conflicting use concerns, whether that be electric power grid, the wind resource and site characterization is one of those things that is always going to be a part of the offshore wind development and design process too. I haven't made a slide for this project because it is ongoing, but there is a project that I can highlight that's under this category that is being funded by the consortium currently, and that project is being done by the Northeastern University. It is titled The Long-Term Availability and Bankability of Offshore Wind Through Hurricane Risk Assessment and Mitigation. So if you're interested in that topic, again, thinking about extreme conditions, thinking about hurricane risk assessment and mitigation, that's something that you'll likely see more from the consortium about into the future as that project continues to go forward, and especially when it wraps up as well. I think on our website, we have a final report from the first phase of this project. It's currently in its second phase. So if you want to get an insight into what that first phase was up to and what might be happening in phase 2, definitely go and check that out. And we can go to the next slide. So here is my last topic area that I'm going to walk us through specifically today, and that is operation and maintenance and safety. And so the two different areas that we have here, adapting installation strategies for U.S. constraints and the O&M innovations, these are, again, critical and touch cross-cutting sections of the other topic areas that we've already talked about today. So we definitely understand that operations and maintenance and safety are critical when thinking about trying to decrease LCOE, when thinking about U.S. workforce development and content, supply chain. A substantial chunk of the cost of offshore wind can be attributed to O&M, and so it's really imperative that these costs be addressed at the design stage. Just like we heard from the environmental and conflicting use topic area, everything kind of has to be done all at once, which is an exciting challenge that the offshore wind industry gets to deal with, but is definitely true. The earlier that we can start understanding the needs and the R&D and innovation that can help improve safety and operations and maintenance of a specific farm that's being designed, the better. The more efficient it can be, the lower cost it can be, which definitely works towards all of our favors. And the subtopics here are really data-driven and aim to drive cost reductions through increased reliability and reduced worker hours at sea. There are two projects that I could highlight here a little bit. Again, definitely go to our website if you're interested more specifically about some of these projects. But one was completed by TagUp, and that was titled The Survival Modeling for Offshore Wind Prognostics. And in that project, they were able to develop, deploy, and demonstrate novel machine learning methods as decision support tools for improving offshore wind maintenance planning. So again, being able to understand maintenance needs as they arrive or before you actually need that maintenance, before it hits a critical time point of failure, is extremely helpful for offshore wind developers and folks dealing with the maintenance of offshore wind farms. So definitely go and check out some more information about that project if that's of interest. And another one that I'll highlight is a project that was done by Tufts University that was titled Physics-Based Digital Twins for Optimal Asset Management. And again, they were able to develop an algorithm that integrates a physics-based model for offshore wind turbines with live measurement data from those turbines. And the software that they were able to create allows for offshore wind asset managers to remotely access the actual turbine health data, providing them with predictive maintenance and failure prediction capabilities. So being able to work very closely with OEMs, with developers, with folks who are going to be, really worried or focused on the maintenance of offshore wind farms, and being able to have that relationship, being able to have projects that really coordinate well when we're in this R&D and innovation stage is also really critical. And so something that we definitely want to laud these projects on as well, being able to work directly and kind of include that in their innovation and research projects. So what I'll do is then ask us to go to our next slide. And taking a step back after running through each of those categories and examples of different projects, trying to take a step back and understand why it matters. So again, to just reiterate the consortium's mission, we really strive to collaborate closely with industry on prioritized R&D activities to reduce the levelized cost of energy for the US, but also while trying to maximize other economic and social benefits as well. We want to make sure that we're being directly responsive to industry, which includes not just funding great projects, which I tried to highlight today, that are going to be commercialized, that are very helpful and useful for the industry, but that are really thoughtfully crafted as well. So making sure that we have a really great process for bringing together and convening different parts of the industry that includes academia, developers, government at the state and federal levels, trying to make sure that these partnerships help support the most leveraged expertise that can be put forward, as well as having really great competitive processes for actually going forward and funding certain innovation projects. So we really want to hit that home. And of course, I think one major reason why it matters is we, looking forward, we continue to try to evaluate the broader impact of these initiatives and trying to think, these are some great projects that we funded and making sure that they are having an impact on the industry writ large, trying to assess future investments. What are some of the future things that we may want to be looking at? If we've funded a lot in O&M and safety, what else do we need to focus on? Are there different aspects that we have not focused our R&D on that need to be focused on? I think transmission is a really great example of an area where there wasn't a lot of talk about transmission on the electric grid for a long time, even though it was a huge issue. And finally, there was a really great push to finally address this major R&D challenge for the offshore wind industry, as well as other industries as well. And so being able to sit down and clearly have those discussions of, how can we use R&D to support the offshore wind electric grid and development of transmission that's going to really support the industry for the US. Having those conversations and understanding where we were then, where we are now, and how we move that into the future as things change is critical. We want to make sure that we're also really catalyzing positive change, supporting this innovation, and thinking about that growth, not only of the consortium, but of course, mostly of the offshore wind industry. We really are here to support the national industry and making sure that we can, again, try to reduce the levelized cost of energy, but support these different aspects of the supply chain, support the understanding of workforce development needs, support different entrepreneurs and the national labs and other organizations, academics who are doing the great research that we're actually funding. So that's definitely something that we have an eye on for the future as well, and we see as a really great benefit to some of the work that we're putting forward, trying to highlight some of these different innovations that are coming out from these great project teams. And again, trying to just bring together industry, government, academia, the folks who are doing these innovations, is a challenge in and of itself. And so finding a lot of value in bringing folks together to best benefit the industry as a whole, thinking of the entire, domestic content, the whole US, I think is a rare and exciting place for the consortium to be focused, thinking on the US as a whole. We try to this last bullet point here, try to share our key learnings and best practices from our funded projects as much as possible. So I'm hoping I gave you a little bit of a taste today of some of those different projects and how they're, really impactful and supporting our mission. But of course, we only had limited time. So I would definitely just hit home one more time that if you're interested in learning a little bit more about any one of the projects that I had mentioned, or are interested in some of the projects that I didn't have time to mention today, that they are on our website in a project database. So please feel free to go check those out. And if we can go to the last slide. I'll just give you a bit of an overview here of what might be coming next and how we're looking to the future as NOWRDC. So there are still many opportunities for R&D and new innovations and advancements to aid the industry. I implied that there's some really great work that we're doing and there's opportunity for more. We also work, I think I had mentioned, through competitive solicitations for offshore wind research as well. And we've had the opportunity to see really great projects, and sometimes, funding is always an issue for everyone. We just can't fund every great project that comes our way. And so we are very clear that there are great innovations that are out there that could be supporting the offshore wind industry. And we want to make sure that we're trying to identify and create opportunities for funding R&D that can be most supportive for the industry as well. So we acknowledge that, and we look forward to funding more projects in the future because there's a lot of expertise and talent and great ideas for innovation that just need the opportunity to be funded and to be utilized and commercialized out in the offshore wind industry. So we work closely with our partners to try to identify those needs. That's something that we're actively doing all day, every day. And one thing that we're mentioning, or that I had mentioned earlier, was the update of our roadmap. So that's kind of that first step, right, of making sure that we at least have in this technical guidance document a real idea of what those needs are and how they need to be updated from that last version. So we're looking forward to updating that. Again, happy to hear from folks if they are familiar with our roadmap and have some suggestions about how this can be improved for looking into 2025. But that's something that we're definitely going to be working on the later half of this year, updating that roadmap. And another thing to keep in mind, if you are interested in receiving funding for any innovation that you might have, we're planning to release a solicitation for offshore wind R&D this summer. There will be more information that will be shared likely next month. I can't share too much information now, but keep an eye out if you're interested in a solicitation for future funding. Stay in touch with NOWRDC because there will be more opportunities this summer and later this year for solicitation for competitive funding. So with that, I will stop chatting and I will thank you all so much for your time today.
Great, thank you, Christine. That was a wonderful presentation, very informative. We have received a few questions, so I'll just go through the list. We have a question about a specific slide for the environmental wildlife monitoring and adaptive management slide. The question is in regards to the talking point on the mismatch between the infrastructure design and the deployment of monitoring systems. Are there any examples of any solutions that have been proposed to address this mismatch? For example, does it involve the operations and maintenance SME to be involved early on with the design engineering team? If so, are there any specific strategies proposed in order to achieve this?
That's a great question. I would like to think that the project team in their final report probably fleshed that out a little bit better than I could describe to you right now. So I would definitely refer you to the final report that's on our website for that specific project, because like I said, I think they have a lot more than I even hinted at on that slide, and probably could explain a little bit better what they were going at there. But I think that seems reasonable. I think the timeline mismatch is clear and difficult because when working to develop an offshore wind farm, there's a lot of moving pieces, which is an understatement, right? All different parts of the offshore wind industry has many different components and many different needs, and that's why it's a challenge. If it wasn't so complex and so big, it wouldn't be something that we're all working in many different areas to focus on. So the timing is critical and difficult in every aspect of design and development. But I think the idea to that is, yes, earlier engagement on all aspects of design throughout the life cycle of an offshore wind farm. The earlier each of those concepts and designs can be coordinated and discussed internally, the better. But of course, not all information is perfect information all at once. Oftentimes when designing offshore wind, right, you're working from limited information at any one time because you're gaining more information as design moves forward and the process for offshore wind approval and design and development moves forward. So with the maximum information that folks have, trying to push up that timeline and start those conversations earlier rather than later is helpful. But I would say if you're looking for more specifics, definitely go to their final report. I think it'd be very helpful for you.
Great, thanks, Christine, for that clarification. We have our next question. For new technologies or innovative methods, what are some of the barriers that projects face in getting to market? Are there partnerships that NOWRDC has to help projects progress to market?
Another great question. So what we try to fund are projects that have a very clear need for the offshore wind industry. So these are kind of at the first level, we're funding projects that have a real clear request from industry. So the first thing that we try to do is if there's a project, an innovation that's like a really wonderful idea and really great, but there's not really a clear need for it, that's likely not going to be something that we're going to address. If there is, however, a really great innovation that solves a clear issue that is directly responsive to something that can support the industry now or sooner rather than later, that's something that we would want to support. In our project management, I didn't talk at all about what's actually happening when these projects are ongoing, when research is happening, but what we have are project advisory boards. And those project advisory boards are created for each R&D project. They bring in external advisors from industry, folks who are willing to, have their time and talk through, every 3 months or so, how the project is going throughout its life cycle. This is critically important and something we've seen as a great benefit to the project team and these projects, because it doesn't just fund a project, say, great, go do this innovation. You get to the end of your project 2 or 3 years later, and the industry says, oh, our needs have changed, or, oh, this isn't exactly what we wanted. You should have used this data set. You are getting that advice and guidance throughout your project life cycle from industry and those external advisors. And so that we see as a really critical aspect to how the consortium operates, how our project management works, to make sure that as these projects are ongoing, they still have the support and the opportunity to stay extremely relevant and be best suited at the completion of these projects for commercialization from that advice and guidance from the industry too. So that's one way that once these projects are funded, we do support them and try to make sure that they're as successful as possible upon completion.
Awesome. And then kind of like playing on this new technology and innovative methods, How is offshore wind using AI in advanced analytics for floating?
Ooh, that's a great question. I am definitely not as involved in the AI side of things, and that's mostly just because of my background and expertise. I am no AI expert, but a great question. I am sure that some of my other staff might have a better opportunity to describe some of that. So I would definitely say stay in touch, reach out to me and my team if there are other questions that I can't answer today, or other things that come up today that we don't have the time to discuss. Happy to chat through that as much as possible. And like I said, also going to our roadmap, probably giving a quick AI search might come up with a couple of things that we've already identified that might be super helpful, and looking at other projects that we've funded as well. I don't think we have too many that are focused on AI, maybe a couple though, but it's certainly not my specific expertise, so I'm not going to be the most helpful for you today.
Absolutely. And then kind of taking a step back for a more broad question, does and now RDC fund basic research, or is the funding more geared towards demonstration of commercial ready innovation products?
It definitely is not focusing so much on basic research, and more focusing on that ready for commercialization aspect. We are kind of in the middle of, if you're familiar with a TRL or a CRL scale, we're kind of in the middle somewhere there. We also do, when we're funding projects through a competitive solicitation, there's a real spectrum in different projects that we fund just based on scale. So I mean, we do fund feasibility projects all the way up to demonstration of full, projects. So there is a spectrum there in readiness or in size of the project, but it's certainly not basic research. We're not going and funding projects that are going to do, a geotechnical study or anything like that, collecting samples, but really making sure that the work that we are doing is innovation that can be applied and utilized by the offshore wind industry to support kind of the offshore wind industry as a whole today and in the near future.
Awesome. And I think we might have time for one last question, which might be a good way to kind of close this out. What are some prioritized areas that NowRDC plans to focus on in the near future?
Good question. So I had mentioned that we do have a competitive solicitation that's coming up kind of in the near future, so keep an eye open for that. I will say some other areas that we are looking at, we've seen real needs and calls for more innovation and specific more R&D on from our board, from our members, from our partners, has been floating offshore wind. This has been transmission, looking at the electric grid. I think those are two areas that we are critically looking at now with some of our members and our partners, trying to identify what are those more specific needs and how can we craft different projects or solicitations for proposals that can get to some of those challenges that we see in the US right now. So definitely keep your eyes open if you're interested in either one of those two. Those are conversations and discussions that we have been having. And the offshore wind, industry changes really fast too. So it's very possible that there might be other topic areas that we are going to be focusing and zoning in on in the near future as well. But for right now, those are two that I can say that we are having a lot of discussions on.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, everybody. So thank you for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. A reminder that the webinar recording and presentation slides will be available on NYSERDA's website. Our next webinar in the series will be on June 12th, and that will be the New York Independent System Operator will be presenting on how offshore wind connects to New York's electricity grid. You can register for future webinars through our events page at win.ny.gov. We also encourage you to check out past webinars in the series on NYSERDA's website and YouTube channel. If you have requests for future topics you would like to hear in the series, Please email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out our Learning from the Experts survey posted on our website. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time.